Welcome to Why We Wander, a podcast about the how and whys of travel, hosted by me, Shannon Keating, and Tamara Walker. So, Tamara, I think you have a question for me this week.
I do, and it's kind of a random question, but it's one that I've been thinking about a lot, which is whether you consider yourself well-traveled.
I think at first blush, yeah. I think that by all accounts, the idea of being well-traveled, having had different types of travel experiences in my life, having gone to a variety of places and having spent time thinking about how to be a better traveler. I think like those all combined sort of maybe contribute to being well-traveled in my book. But I would say as a caveat, like it really depends on who you're talking to, because there, I think with all types of pastimes and ways that people like to kind of become a part of a community, whether it's like a travel community or a crafting community or a learning how to do a certain technical skill. Like there's so many levels of what it means to be good at it.
Yeah.
Or to be, one of like the power users or whatnot. And, in that sense, I am totally not well-traveled. If you looked at the map of the places I've been to, it does not, like there are not pins in every single continent even, let alone, covering the map. And, I don't have any stories of that time when I traveled by foot from here to here and then slept all night in a ferry. And that, I don't have some of like the kind of classic like backpacker stories, I guess, that maybe some people might contribute to being like a hardcore traveler. I don't know. I guess it depends on who you're talking to. And I think though, at a general level, yes. What about you?
Yeah, and I think that's why it's such an interesting question, because it gets at what the criteria is and like whether it's about the number of places that you've gone or the way you've experienced those places. And like, we follow a lot of people on our Instagram page, and there's a whole world of travel influencers. And one trend that I have kind of picked up on, and maybe it's a function of like who we follow more than like what the kind of landscape looks like. But like one trend that I've noticed that's really interesting is that there are a lot of people who travel to a lot of different places, but in very similar ways, especially people who are paid travel influencers who get invited by hotels to have certain experiences of the property. And maybe some of that is also inflected by the pandemic, where the property is really the long and short of someone's experience of a destination. But I feel like I saw that even before the pandemic, especially like luxury hotels and resorts that were inviting people to kind of showcase their offerings. And so those are people who have traveled to a lot of places, but have they necessarily experienced a version of that place that is different, like you said, like the whole backpacker experience of things? Because I do think that somehow luxury travel has become synonymous with being well-traveled, like having these really custom, luxurious experiences kind of stands in for it. But I don't know if that actually, appeals to me, or at least to my definition of being well-traveled, because it kind of implies that you have to be able to afford to be well-traveled, when
right.
I don't know that that's the case, right? Like part of what is so interesting and appealing about backpacker travel experiences is the sort of shoestring budget of it all, and being able to do as much as possible by spending as little as possible and like cutting corners on things like lodging and staying in hostels, or by cutting out going to restaurants and instead like cooking or just buying things that you can assemble like a sandwich or something in your hostel or hotel room, or, driving or going over land rather than like taking expensive trains or flights, and being creative and like having to kind of make choices and decisions. And to me, that kind of factors into the definition of being well-traveled, like really having to take a close look at what your priorities are, and I'll make sure that like the plan actually aligns with those priorities. And sometimes it means making sacrifices, but that is part of it too, right? Because it also means that you have to do the work and like do the research. And I guess that's, and not to kind of bash travel influencers, but I do think that so often the image that we get from them is one where decisions don't really have to be made, much less hard decisions. And so there's something that is very kind of smoothed over about the travel experience. And those are things that I think are so valuable about the travel experience, just having to be in touch with what you really want out of an experience and the kind of person you want to be before, during, and after the experience. So I guess that's one thing that comes to mind for me, that idea of luxury and wealth not standing in for being well traveled in the way that it tends to be in our culture.
Yeah. And what's so funny is that when I was judging myself against the idea of well traveled, the first thing that came to my mind was like, I'm not, although I've had backpackery experiences and I've, done a lot of budget travel in my life and everything. And I'm certainly not like a full-time luxury traveler either. But the group that I was kind of judging myself against was more of the former, more of people who have just like traveled around the world multiple times and, done it on a shoestring. And I just know if I was sitting around a campfire with a bunch of people who were self-defined travelers, like I'm sure that I would be lower on the list of having how many experiences I've had or how long I've been away from home. And it's funny because then you're kind of what you're saying, that you often are thinking about this in relation to, at least by what we're surrounded by on social media, is this other type of travel, this like luxury travel. So it's just like funny, like what your starting point is as to how you're defining yourself against. And I totally see what you're saying about the travel influencers of today. And it's so unfortunate because, it all goes back to just like the algorithms of how we're served up these influencers on social media and how they're able to work to provide all this content is because, they're receiving sponsorship from these luxury locations. And those locations don't want to present the experience as anything less than being perfect and smooth and not having problems of having to figure out how I got from point A to point B. Whereas I feel like there was before that, like with travel blogging and obviously travel writing, there were so many more opportunities to share like all sides of your travel experience because, I guess for better or for worse, you weren't really getting paid for doing it. And maybe if you had a blog, like maybe you had some ads on your sidebar, but it wasn't like a direct transaction of like, write this copy because I paid for your trip. It was more, hey, you have a lot of readers who like to read about your travel experiences. So, I will, as a company, pay to have an ad on your website, but I'm not telling you what to write about. So it's just, I guess it's like the nature of the way media is going today. And I wonder, like, where are some great places to find stories that reflect the kind of well-traveled person that we're talking about? I think that would be maybe a great list to pull together of like, where are those stories right now?
Yeah, that's such a great point about the way sponsored content has kind of taken over the travel industry. And it's reminding me of one of the things I encountered that kind of got me thinking about what it means to be well-traveled, because I remember seeing a description of this trip that the Four Seasons, or the series of trips that the Four Seasons hotel group sponsors, because they also have a private jet that you can take to all their properties around the world. And they kind of do it by theme. So there's like a African safari themed one. There is a South America themed one, a Europe themed one. And the through line is that every stop along the way is spent at a Four Seasons hotel, and you make all of those stops via a Four Seasons private jet. And it's an outrageously expensive trip. It's like 200 some $1,000s per person, maybe for children.
Oh my God.
It's nuts. And so I imagine that like for the people who take that sort of trip, whether they've gone anywhere else in the world before or after that trip, would probably think of themselves as having had this like really extensive travel experience, because they tend to go to multiple destinations, either like covering an entire continent or crossing continents. And so they probably end up feeling like they're well traveled as a result of that. But again, like the question of whether you have to pay, and, you know, obviously at a baseline, everyone has to pay to travel, right? Like it's a privileged experience no matter how you're doing it. But within the context of kind of having to pay the price of entry, should you have to pay that much money? And again, it seems to kind of strip the experience of the empowering aspects of travel that, you know, we lean so heavily on in our work at The Wandering Scholar, and just think about as being so important to our own experience as young people. So I feel like that kind of thing, and maybe I'm just being a hater because it sounds really posh and luxurious, but it also seems to kind of miss the point of travel and exploration, that it's not just about kind of maintaining a comfort level, because that's, you know, the ethos of the Four Seasons, right? That no matter where you are in the world, what you can trust is that you're going to have this like immensely comfortable and immaculate and luxurious experience. So that's one of the things that was kind of floating through my mind. And I remember reading an article by a journalist who, you know, had the fortune of being able to take one of these trips for free in order to write about it, basically writing brochure copy, right? So of course, she's going to say incredible and like positive things about this experience, because she got this, you know, trip paid for that costs more than most houses in the US, right? That then means that like you're not really getting much. And maybe with something like that, like of course it's going to be incredible, like it has to be, right? But at the same time, like the fact that she was in exchange for writing such favorable things, like getting this free trip, and that's like an extreme version of what you're describing, right? That like even when it comes to just like a trip to Mexico or to California, even from the East Coast, like if you're being paid to talk about it, then you do tend to sound, and like so many of the, you know, posts that we read on social media, and even in kind of the travel media more generally, because often people are being comped to be able to talk about their experience there. And so it does make you question a little bit like what the truth is, right, of these experiences, if they're being sponsored, right, to talk about their experiences.
Yeah. And I think it's totally like who is sponsoring it, and if it's the hotel and that's what's being reviewed, then that's probably not like the best thing to be judging the hotel by. If it's, you know, the tourism board, then it's hard to judge the whole trip by, right? Because they're making the whole entire destination sound amazing. It's also kind of like exactly what entity is underwriting this whole experience for the writer. But God, that trip just sounds, I mean, it's just beyond, it's ostentatious. It's just, I can't even really begin to fathom why, even if you had that amount of excess funds, why that's how you would ever choose to spend it. It's just, you know, I mean, it just, I feel like it gets to a certain level where you're like, that's just too much for anybody. Like, right? I don't know. Maybe I'm just, I would be expecting to travel to Mars for that price, honestly.
Right. And I feel like, you know, for those people, that's probably their next trip.
Yeah.
And honestly, I have a feeling that part of the appeal is the other people on the trip, that it's kind of a networking opportunity and an opportunity to kind of see the world in a way that's super comfortable with people who will make you feel super comfortable. And so it's like comfort all the way, which you know, I totally understand why that would hold appeal. And so maybe I'm also just, as I'm talking about this, kind of getting at a pillar of what I think of as being well-traveled, which is to be willing to be in uncomfortable situations. And like that can be defined in so many different ways. And I don't necessarily have like a particular situation in mind, but like when I think back to some of my more rewarding travel experiences, I think, for example, about this time I went to Peru and did this hike that was, you know, packaged as something that was a lot more low key than it ultimately ended up being. It was like a hike into a canyon, and it turned out to be along really steep switchbacks, and the descent was really stressful. And then we had a few hours to sleep and to wake up before the sun came up so that we could get back to the top. And, it took like 4 hours to get to the top, and it was like a really kind of uncomfortable, unpleasant, really difficult experience that at the time I was like, I can't believe my friend talked me into this. I can't believe I agreed to do it. This is the worst thing I've ever done. But it also, taught me a lot about myself and what I was capable of doing, even without having kind of intended to do it in the first place, that I had these like reserves that I could draw from. So that kind of stuff. And, some of it is also just like romanticizing the past, especially in the context of not really being able to do a ton of travel right now, and, romanticizing our youth. But those things I do think matter, or are part of why we go into the unknown, is to kind of learn something new about ourselves. And I don't really know what I would learn. Maybe in that kind of luxury experience, the Four Seasons private jet, maybe I would learn that like I never want to go back to anything uncomfortable ever again in my life.
Maybe.
That's what I would learn about myself.
I don't think so. I think this type of experience that you're describing, this Four Seasons experience and the private jet and everything, it almost needs a new term. Like, it's not really even travel as we think of travel. It's like a bubble experience. It's almost like you're virtually traveling, because like you said, like the Four Seasons are all very, I haven't actually stayed at one. I did actually just recently go to a spa at the Four Seasons outside of LA. And I've been in the lobbies of some of them, and they do have similar, obviously, design aesthetics, right? Like, you kind of know you're in a Four Seasons. So it's a really controlled experience. These hotels even control like your sense of smell. Like, they have signature scents that they waft through the air.
Yeah.
That they spend money developing, and then they pump through, and sometimes it gives you a headache, right? And then you're getting on a jet, and you're kind of being lifted up and plopped back down. And I kind of feel like you're not even really doing very much. I mean, this gets into this world of like living in virtual spaces. And like, at that rate, like, maybe you would just stay in your really comfortable, whatever type of place you live in, if you can spend $200,000 on a trip, and just have like some goggles on that are like giving you this experience of being in all of these places, like a really like mind body experience, because what is it? It's not travel in any way that we think of it. You're not, like you said, you're not making decisions. You're not really meeting people except for the people who are right next to you. It's sometimes a critique that we have about some forms of, college and high school student travel, where you're surrounded by your classmates at the school you went to, or people who are all, from the same area. And if you don't kind of actively try to break out of that bubble every once in a while you're on the trip, it can feel very insular. And, you might not even realize that you're missing out on opportunities that you could have, because baseline, it's great just to get out, right? It's great just to go somewhere different and be somewhere. But like, the things that you're missing out on, you'll almost never know. And that's so unfortunate. So anyways, I propose a new term for this form of travel that you're describing. Some kind of bubble wrap or something.
Yeah, no, it's such a good point about like even just the control over your sense of smell, because so much of, your experience of a new destination really is about how it smells, like how it smells in the streets and like what the food smells like. So yeah, like to miss out on that. And it also reminds me, just as you were describing it, like just entering a pod and descending in this like comfortable space, of a kind of like pub crawl.
Yeah.
If you were in like a party bus
Yes.
and like, you got off the party bus, went into the bar, had your little drink at the bar, like maybe a signature cocktail.
Yeah.
And then you get back on, you're not walking down the street, you're not getting a sense of the neighborhood and like how it shifts from one kind of community to another as you get to the next bar or whatever, and just on a more extreme scale, but it does sound like something along those lines.
And you're maybe not building in that time. So just taking that pub crawl analogy a little farther, like you're not realizing how inebriated you're getting, right? Because you're not actually like self-reflecting. You're just kind of like being transported from one place to the next in a little bubble, and you're not worried about your surroundings and where you are. And I think in a trip experience like this Four Seasons example, you're not having maybe moments of self-reflection of like, what did I learn from that experience? Because you're just like off to the next place. And we all do this sometimes with trips where we have like a bucket list of things we want to do on this trip and we want to get done. And we're kind of like rushing from one place to the next and not always building in these opportunities for reflection along the way. And so I think that's, just like another downside of this form of travel that's a little bit more about showing off about it rather than the purpose of travel.
Yeah, it's funny because having said all that, like I could totally see why something like this would be appealing to like senior citizens or people with limited mobility who do want to still experience going to parts of the world that are, things they've read about, places they've read about or seen on television, but also don't really want to deal with the logistics of getting to and from and don't really have it in them to do long walks and things like that, but still want to have the experience. Like you could totally imagine a retiree really getting so much out of that experience. What struck me as crazy, though, was the fact that so many of these trips are designed for families with young children. And the idea of like a 6-year-old being gifted a $160,000, because I do think they give discounts for children, like $160,000 trip. Like what is left for that child to do? Because I think part of what makes it make sense for me for senior citizens is the fact that, they've lived a long time. They've probably had the backpacker experience or the more kind of humble experience of travel. And this is what they've kind of worked up to and decided that they've earned. But like for like a 6-year-old or a 10-year-old, like what is it going to take for them to be able to derive any pleasure? Like that must set an expectation that every travel experience henceforth needs to be completely like that. But at a certain point, you're going to run out of places to go and run out of, or at least, especially if it's tied to Four Seasons, then you're going to run out of places to go because they're not literally everywhere. So it does seem as though it just creates an appetite that I don't think can ever be fully sated if you start that young with something like that.
That's so interesting. But, I think what is hopeful is that 6-year-old will hopefully, if given the right influences, realize that there actually is so much more for them to see, that experience that they had when they were 6 traveling with their family is not really what it's like to travel. And to see all these parts of the world. And, hopefully what happens is that they realize that was okay. That was something that was part of their childhood, something kind of unique, but that there's so many more ways to see the world, so many more ways to interact with other people. And, the hope is that they take that experience, but then also just kind of break open the world in totally other ways. And probably because they have, what my hope would be is that if they're a child that comes from those means, that there's something that comes up in their childhood or teenagehood or adulthood that makes them realize that their experience was so unique and so ridiculous that it's not normal. But like, how can they take those means and figure out ways to make travel or other types of educational opportunities accessible to many more people, and so they don't have a lot more to do with the Four Seasons, but hopefully they kind of have like a rubber band moment and realize, okay, well, that was crazy. My childhood was crazy, but what can I be doing with my time? And I think that
is,
that's all we have hope for, right?
Yeah, no, it's a lovely hope. And you make a really interesting point too about interaction, because I think often what is missing, and not just in this weird extreme example that we've been given, but like in other cases where you're just kind of entering a bubble of a given destination, is that the interaction is limited to people who work at that, especially like as representatives of the destination. Like it's usually limited to the people who work at the hotel or work at the resort or something. And then it just means, and we kind of talk about this in the context of the Wandering Scholar, that it means that like your only interaction with the people who represent that community is with them in service roles, right?
Yes.
And subordinate roles versus them as peers, them as people you have something to learn from. And that often happens even in the world of service tourism. So not to romanticize other kinds of interactions, because sometimes service tourism does that too, right? It casts the people in the community as purely people who need something from you and who are beneficiaries of your largesse, versus people who have their own ideas about how, things should look and the kind of future that their community should kind of plan for. So those are things that are also missing. And I think another pillar of being well-traveled is having meaningful interactions with the people in that location that aren't just about, them bringing you drinks and serving you food and, thanking you for something. And instead, that require you to, thank them, and not just for, a lesson they teach you, or at least a hollow lesson, but for them kind of sharing their culture in really interesting ways and teaching you something that you wouldn't have known had you not, had the opportunity for this face-to-face interaction.